Translators having an opportunity to remind our participants on the use of the interpretation during this session. So I will ask each of our languages to go and present, starting with Italy, Italian, Portuguese, and then Spanish, and then Indonesian. And I believe those are all that we have. All right, let me turn off interpretation so that can begin. All right, so I have turned off interpretation so that that can begin.
Ok, namaskar a todos. A interpretação para português já está disponível. Por favor, vejam suas opções de linguagem quando ele ligar a interpretação de volta. Ok? Namaskar.
Thank you.
Namaskar a todos, es para avisarles que ya la interpretación en español va a empezar y por favor vayan a las salas de interpretación para poder empezar.
Thank you. Are there any other translators who would like to share at this time? Okay.
I don't think I've been made a translator yet. I'm not sure.
Yeah, we're trying to invite people to the rooms.
May I ask who that is?
It's Amristara. I wrote in the chat.
Oh, but what Ricky's wants, Gayatri, is, or Amrita Stara, is if you can give a message in
Sure.
Italian in the general room. So
Yeah, sure. Except I'm not sure if we have an Italian translation because I haven't been assigned yet. I can do that.
I can put you here, yes.
Okay, great.
Italian, so, and one more time on your name, I didn't quite catch it.
Amristara.
Amristara. There we go. Italian
Amristara,
interpretation.
before you go into this in the room, just invite the Italian speakers. Yeah.
Yes, sure. Ok, chi ha bisogno della traduzione italiana è invitato adesso a scegliere il canale italiano per poter iniziare la traduzione. Grazie.
Thank you. And I guess we have just do we have someone from Indonesian language?
Yes, this is Haridea.
Yeah, great. Yes, Haridea, you can announce.
Baik, selamat malam Bapak Ibu. Untuk interpretasi Indonesia bisa dibantu dengan saya, Haridea, Pak. Terima kasih.
All right, and I will now turn the program over to our moderator for this session.
Okay, thank you, Ricky. And thank you, Amrit. That was an amazing presentation, very inspiring. And as Peter said, neohumanism is something to put in practice. And I think that's the challenge, is to put everything that we're doing into practice. So our presentation this morning is it's called New Ideas in Global Governance and Leadership. And we're going to present a little bit of the bad news and a little bit of the good news of how we can actually turn around the direction of our civilization, which doesn't seem to be heading in a very good direction at this moment. I'd like to start with a, maybe they could mute somebody.
Yes, I'll take care of that. Apologies.
Yeah. I'd like to start with a quote from Malcolm Weiner of Harvard Kennedy School, who writes about movement of civilizations, and particularly the fall of civilizations. It gives a list here. Major episodes of climate change, crises-induced mass migrations, pandemics, dramatic advances in methods of warfare and transport, and human failings in crises, including societal lack of resilience and the madness, incompetence, cultic focus, or ignorance of rulers. Now that seems relevant to our current situation today. It is, and it has been relevant for thousands of years. I mean, these are some of the major factors in the falls of civilizations. And of course, not all of them we can do something about. Climate change comes, pandemics appear, but we can respond differently. And as our civilization has progressed in technologies, we can respond effectively if we want to, using our knowledge and our wisdom to some of these changes. But if we don't, then the fall of our societies may become inevitable. So what we see here is the repetition. If you look historically, we see repetition of war, destruction, hunger, refugees, stupidity, selfishness, again and again and again. I just read that the most violent century in recorded history of humanity took place about 20 years ago. You know, and the 20th century is considered the most violent history, the most violent century in recorded human history. So what is the progress? What is the progress that we're witnessing today? And how many times when you're alone and pondering the fate of the world, or maybe just the fate of your community, you shake your head and wonder why, why again? You know, in recent times, we heard that capitalism was going to make us all affluent, and democracy was going to give us security and rights. And they have worked to some extent for some people. And our major players in the games today, our nation states, play around on the international stage, devising their treaties and strategies and promoting their interests, and the interests of whom? Certainly governments over time have produced benefits for the public good, even some environmental laws, economic regulations, mostly as a result of public uproar and pressure and demands. So previously we have we've accepted these situations, but something today has become a little different. In spite of how we recycle our problems and watch, you know, societies come and go, it seems that something has changed now. You know, previously poverty, when you think of poverty, you know, historically people used to think poverty was just a natural thing, was just inevitable part of our society. And then we developed sort of sympathy for other people, and we decided we needed to give them aid, mutual aid, or develop social services to alleviate this poverty. But now we realize that poverty isn't necessary at all, that actually poverty could be, we have it within our capacity to eliminate poverty completely. So the level of consciousness continues to rise in spite of all these repetitions of disasters and wars and destruction in our society, in our world. This helps evolve our consciousness. We've come to a point now, I think, on this planet where we realize that another world is possible, that something is different, that we could do something really different than we have been doing for a long time. So we're at a turning point. And according to Pierre Sarkar, we are on or have passed the threshold of a new era. Sohail at the beginning of in his opening remarks mentioned that we are at a crossroads and we have to decide which way we want to go. What do we need to do to change this? And who will do it? We need new leaders. Now, if we look back, we've had many great leaders. You talk about Mandela, and historically, like Ashok or Akbar. I mean, throughout history, there's been great leaders who have come together, who have pulled together great states and moved forward. But now we're looking for a different type of leadership. And this leadership is not going to come down from spaceships. It's not going to come out of magic lanterns. It's not going to drop from the sky. We're not waiting for saviors. We're waiting for people to come forward and actually make these changes. This session is going to look at governance, its current state, and possibilities, and perhaps a way out. We will examine the types of government that humans have created and their limitations. We will step back to understand how these patterns of growth and destruction repeat themselves and how we can change, or we might be able to change these patterns. Then we will consider leadership, a special type of leadership, not the great leadership type where some great leader comes and fixes everything, but a more sustainable and reliable form of leadership for this planet. During this session, we will be presenting ideas from the progressive utilization theory, also known as PROUT, which was formulated by Pierre Sarkar starting in 1959. So I'm going to begin with a small presentation, sort of an overview of what we're going to be talking about generally as far as governance and leadership. And then Craig Runde will be presenting on world government and world constitution. And Satya Turner then will present more on what we know as far as the cutting edge technologies of leadership training and how they can help us produce a new type of leadership on this planet. So I'm going to begin. First, let me just get this up here. Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So, Okay, breaking the cycle of bad governments. A proud approach to synthetic leadership. So first of all, let's look at governance. Governance is the way rules, norms, and actions are structured, sustained, regulated, and held accountable. This decides who makes decisions, how they make decisions, what is the impact of these decisions, and how to hold these decisions accountable. So here we look at this graph, we see this sort of a spectrum moving from on the far left, we have democracy or direct democracy is probably the most pure form of democracy where people make direct choices. You have a group of people, everyone has a voice, everyone is involved in the decision making. That's direct democracy. And on the far other side, we have authoritarianism, and the extreme form of that is totalitarianism, which means that the government, the form of government, has total control over every form of expression of the people it is governing. So within this spectrum, there's different other forms here, different other types of government. We have representational democracy, which is what we have in many countries today. You elect leaders, and those leaders represent you in the government. Then we have oligarchies, aristocracies, theocracies, more authoritarian types of government that involve a select group of people that are really making the decisions in a country. Dictatorships could be party dictatorships, or normally it's just one person who's calling all the shots. Here's a picture of some two people who represent democracies in our world today. And we have two people representing authoritarian governments. They sort of look alike. There's some similarities there, actually. So I'd like to talk a little bit about social institutions. So social institutions are mechanisms or patterns of social order focused on meeting social needs. Right. So these are the large institutions in our society. What we have here is some of the major institutions. There are other social institutions, of course. These are some of the major ones that we see, major players in our society. And I looked at some of the governance structures. If you look at them, well, at a state and government level, it's varied. We have some that are more democratic, some are authoritarian. If you look at the economy, the capitalist structure of economy is basically run by private businesses, and those private businesses are structured as basically as authoritarian type of structures. Same with religion, generally speaking. Of course, there are differences. For example, in the economy, we do have cooperatives and other employee-owned businesses, which are more democratic forms. But this is sort of a general idea of what we can see operating in the world today. Military is definitely top down, and families, due to the dominance of patriarchy still operating our society, are somewhat authoritarian. Although, of course, there are families, and there are maybe more and more families today that try to operate differently, but generally speaking, if you look around the world, this is what we see to a large extent. So if we look at this, the different, what's happening in society, we have a lot of authoritarianism operating, right? I'd just like to give you an idea how these things operate by looking at, different societies produce different configurations of these institutions, depending on which ones are more dominant. So for example, a military junta, we see here, the military is the dominant institution. The state is subsumed under that. A lot of the economy is controlled by the military. Religion, often, in many cases, religion has an alliance with the military. And there's always overlap between families and religion. These are, by the way, these vary according from country to country, so you can't generalize, but I just wanted to give people an idea how this looks. If we look at a party dictatorship, let's say in China, we have the state, it's a dominant player. A military is under the state. The state controls part, maybe not all of the economy. A lot of the family life is controlled by the state, and particularly in religion in China is probably not so much under, well, they definitely try to control it, but it's more of a, perhaps an independent type of institution at this point. There's a theocracy, let's say something like in Iran, we have religion playing a major role here, and the state, military, these are all heavily influenced by religious leaders. And then we have constitutional democracies. So this is how I represented it. Today, in the case, most of them are capitalistic economies, and so the economy, even though the state is the governing body, it is heavily influenced by the economy or private players in the economy. Okay. So today in the world, I know since I have, throughout my lifetime, the idea is that, yes, democracy is the best system. We're all moving towards democracy, and, there are some, a smattering of crazy dictators around the world. But if we really look at the situation, it's not exactly that at all, right? This is a democracy index put out by The Economist. This is their intelligence unit. And this index is based on 5 factors. They look at the electoral process and pluralism, civil liberties, the functioning of government, political participation, and political culture. And based on that, they, have also designated countries according to these color codes, whether you are a full democracy, a flawed hybrid, or an authoritarian regime. If you look at this, there's not first of all, there's not a whole lot of full democracies in our world today. You have Scandinavia, you have Canada and Australia. United States is a flawed democracy as of, I think, 2019. It's failed on some of these measures, but I think a large percentage of the world population lives under authoritarian governments. That's the reality, right? Apparently, even though more than 60% of the world's countries are electoral democracies, most of them do not provide equal protection under the law. In other words, even
Muchas de ellas no proveen protección. Aunque las llamamos democracias, las personas no tienen el derecho para una democracia completa. Y muchos de ellos son gobernados por partidos políticos. Y lo que estamos diciendo es que en estos momentos estamos en una tendencia que se aleja de la democracia. Este índice está diciendo que nos estamos alejando más y más de la democracia. Este es otro índice interesante de la percepción de la corrupción. Cómo la gente percibe la corrupción en sus países. Este es producido por Transparencia Internacional en el 1995, desde 1995. Es que lo que pasa es que se está incrementando la conciencia de la calidad de los líderes y las personas no están contentas con sus líderes y también van a notar que hay una relación entre este índice y el que les acabo de mostrar. Y eso es lo que entre menos corrupción, más democracia. Hay más democracia. Entre más corrupción, menos democracia. Este fue una encuesta del Pew Research Center por 34 países. ¿Cuántos están satisfechos con la democracia? Y la mayoría no están satisfechos con sus democracias. Están mucho menos satisfechos con sus oficiales elegidos. Ellos quieren tener voto y quieren participar en el gobierno, pero no están felices con cómo están las cosas. Retos para la democracia. ¿Cuáles son los retos de la democracia? Hay muchos. La corrupción, votantes que no están preparados. Esto lo vemos mucho en este país. Ha sido un ejercicio de encontrarse a sí mismo cómo es que la mitad del país puede votar por un líder que tiene obvias deficiencias morales. Falta de representantes y líderes capaces. No tenemos personas que pueden liderar. La influencia de mayores intereses sociales, económicos y políticos, los intereses de instituciones grandes que convierten la democracia en oligarquía. Son formas muy deficientes de democracia. Y la falta de importancia que se le da a las necesidades de las minorías. Entonces hay muchas deficiencias en la democracia. Muchas de ellas las podemos ver hoy mismo, las pueden ver en sus propios países. Ustedes tienen la democracia, ven los problemas que están pasando. Pero obviamente no es solamente la democracia, porque la democracia todavía es una de las mejores formas de gobierno que tenemos. Porque por lo menos responde hasta cierto punto por las necesidades de la gente. Si miramos en el otro lado, los gobiernos autoritarios, muchos de ellos podemos ver que son mucho peores, pero si podemos ver en todas las estructuras de gobierno, podemos ver problemas como conductas anéticas, conflictos entre grupos y desequilibrio del poder, falta de derechos universales y libertades y la falla de no poder alcanzar las necesidades de la gente. Estas son fallas de las formas de gobierno de hoy. Entonces, ¿qué podemos hacer? ¿Qué podemos hacer? Voy a hablar de unas ideas que el Proud nos ha dado de cómo cómo poder ayudar a este problema de del gobierno. Es las fluctuaciones consistentes de los gobiernos, porque lo que pasa es que en el tiempo, nuevos gobiernos, nuevas sociedades surgen, que vienen y traen soluciones y en el tiempo estas decisiones se convierten en decisiones malas y lo vemos como un ciclo que se repite en la historia. Entonces, lo que el Proud dice acerca de las dinámicas sociales dialécticas es que una sociedad se crea a partir de la síntesis y trae esperanza, nuevas ideas. Y es una de estas nuevas ideas, nuevos líderes empiezan a solucionar problemas, es como que traen un nuevo aire al sistema, pero después de un tiempo, ellos se paran de cambiar y a medida que consiguen más y más poder, se corrompen porque el poder corrompe y dejan de hacer el esfuerzo de resolver los problemas de la sociedad. Y para poder mantener su poder social, ellos empiezan a explotar a la gente. Entonces su forma de gobierno se convierte en una tesis y la oposición surge como la antítesis del gobierno. Entonces este proceso de tesis y de antítesis es muy motivado por la explotación que ejerce el gobierno del sistema. Eventualmente se llega a un punto de total intolerancia y entonces algo pasa, algo por una revolución, una evolución y un nuevo proceso empieza. Este ciclo continúa a través de la historia. Lo hemos visto, lo pueden ver en todas las sociedades, todas las civilizaciones. Esta subida al poder, esta era dorada y luego este declinamiento, esta caída, estas transformaciones mayores. Es como, es un proceso dialéctico que va una y otra vez.
Proud says is that
Proud dice que si podemos intervenir en este punto, cuando las sociedades empiezan a declinar, si nosotros podemos intervenir y producir un cambio, en vez de esperar y pasar por todo este dolor de la sociedad de explotación, podemos ejercer un cambio aquí, entonces podemos hacer algo para evitar toda esta degeneración y esta pérdida de vida innecesaria en la sociedad. Entonces, ¿cómo se vería? Como la progresión natural, si lo ves, que va para arriba y para abajo. Algunas veces va muy abajo, otras veces va muy arriba, se pone muy bueno y después baja otra vez. Es muy difícil ver el progreso en esto, el progreso humano. El siglo XX detrás de nosotros, pero no sabemos qué es lo que va hacia adelante. Entonces, lo que el Proud propone es una progresión sintética en el que hay un tipo de intervención que nos va a ayudar a evitar estas bajadas y poder movernos hacia adelante. Para hacer esto, Proud propone 3 ideas principales. Una es la descentralización del poder económico y el poder político, la formación de instituciones, metainstituciones que crean leyes que apoyan esta economía y la reestructuración política. Un gobierno global que va a tener una constitución global y la creación de líderes sintéticos que proveen, nos guían y tienen capacidad para esta nueva estructura. Son competentes en nuestra nueva estructura. Entonces, el punto es, en la economía proudista, El Estado es descentralizado.
So Proud
Pero-
decentralizes and democratizes the economy. It gives
Proud descentraliza y democratiza la economía. Deja que la gente sea la que maneje la economía.
people are met
Entonces las necesidades de la gente son alcanzadas a partir de la economía,
the knowledge of
porque tienen el conocimiento de cómo esta economía funciona. Ellos son los que manejan la economía a nivel local y colectivamente se toman las decisiones y se hace funcionar. Obviamente esto no es solamente a nivel local, pero también a niveles más altos, pero empieza a niveles locales. Entonces la democracia existe en la economía. El Estado es descentralizado. El Estado es centralizado porque, como sabes, no todas las personas tienen la capacidad de liderar o producir estos cambios.
in other words, it's a form of
En otras palabras, es una forma,
centralization is a type of restricted
la
democracy.
centralización es una forma de democracia restrictiva. En otras partes, las elecciones se pasan, pero es para personas, las personas que se eligen son personas que están calificadas para liderar, porque estas personas están tomando decisiones que van a afectar las vidas de todos los demás.
Part of the centralized government
Parte de este gobierno centralizado
take what an assortment of diverse
es tomar un grupo de diversificados
world government that has the power to actually make decisions and
que tienen el
policies.
poder de tomar decisiones y cambiar políticas.
And Craig Runde will be talking more about this.
Y Greg va a hablar más de esto al final de esta presentación.
And then synthetic leadership
Y el liderazgo sintético.
is the ability to influence others to achieve
Liderazgo es lo que puede influenciar a otros a alcanzar una meta
and remove exploitative
específica.
systems.
Tienen la habilidad de movilizar a la gente a resistir y a retirar los sistemas explotativos. Necesitamos líderes que pueden identificar
This exploitation wherever
la
it is,
explotación donde se encuentra
mobilize people to
y movilizar a las personas a resistirlo,
structure
removerlo y a construir nuevas estructuras.
and new synthesis. That's what synthetic leadership is. Or Sarkar calls these sadvi.
Sarkar los llama sadvipras.
They mean those who
Significa
intellect
quienes utilizan su intelecto para mover a la sociedad hacia un camino de benevolencia.
these leaders will have to be
Estos líderes van a tener que tienen que estar desarrollados moral y espiritualmente.
important that they are
Tienen que
trained in the values and
ser entrenados en los valores y la implementación del neohumanismo y la teoría del Proud y la práctica del Proud.
along proudest lines. They have to be skilled
Tienen que ser
in mobilization.
capacidades en los cambios sociales y la movilización. Tienen que tener una naturaleza de servicio y sacrificio. Tienen que ser muy disciplinados y organizados y tienen que ser capaces de trabajar colectivamente.
What we're talking about here is not
Aquí lo que estamos hablando no es
one. Synthetic leadership is not just
el liderazgo sintético, no es un gran líder que viene de 10 líderes y está sentado en una mesa. No, son varios líderes que están trabajando en forma colectiva para poder mover a la sociedad hacia adelante.
so what we are proposing here.
Entonces, lo que nosotros estamos proponiendo aquí, lo que queremos proponer
Synthetic leadership
es
training program at the
un liderazgo sintético de entrenamiento, programa de entrenamiento de liderazgo sintético en la Universidad Neohumanística. Vamos a tener que tener un sistema de reclutamiento para identificar, invitar a los candidatos, tener que tener un entrenamiento en línea y en persona. El currículo tiene que tener un desarrollo espiritual y moral, estudios en liderazgo, estudios interdisciplinarios, teoría y práctica del neohumanismo y el Proud, competencias en pensamiento crítico y mentores y apoyo financiero. Necesitamos y crear estos líderes en todas partes del mundo, de todas las razas, de todos los géneros. Tenemos que crear un liderazgo selectivo que va a ayudar a nuestra civilización. Las corporaciones de hoy, si miran los programas de liderazgo, son liderazgo corporativo. Nosotros necesitamos urgentemente en este momento que nuestros entrenamientos empiecen a crear este tipo de sadvipas, este tipo de líderes, y empezar a identificar los aliados con los que podemos trabajar, identificar y eliminar sociedades explotativas y mover a la sociedad hacia adelante. Entonces, ¿quiénes van a ser estas personas? No van a ser superhéroes. No es lo que estamos interesados. Personas que son algunos que han sido alterados biológicamente o que tienen poderes increíbles. Básicamente simplemente estamos buscando por gente que va a hacer el trabajo. Yo quiero decirles que esta es una idea que nosotros estamos proponiendo a la Universidad de Neumanismo. Ustedes van a ver una forma al final de esta conferencia. Si quieren compartirlo de formas en que pueden contribuir al desarrollo de esta universidad, si las personas están interesadas en ser entrenadores o si quieren ser entrenados, tienen que llenar este formulario y nosotros los vamos a contactar. Muchas gracias. Y ahora nos vamos a ver la presentación de Craig. Déjenme.
Just let me know when you're ready.
One second.
Your idea, Namaskara, is to be inside the political party in order to have
Una idea es estar en los partidos políticos para poder influenciar el nuevo gobierno y el nuevo tipo de liderazgo. Ese es entrar en esa es tu idea, es entrar en los partidos políticos. Vamos a tener al final, una sesión para preguntas y respuestas. Este tipo de liderazgo pueden lanzarse políticamente, puede ser una estrategia muy importante, pero en otras sociedades es probable que no se debe hacer, pero ellos pueden participar en las elecciones.
So Craig Rundy is the former director of the Center for Conflict Dynamics and Mediation Training.
Craig Rundy era el director del Centro por Mediación en San Petersburg, Florida. Ha coautorado
including
varios
becoming a
libros.
conflict competent leader, building conflict competent teams, and developing your conflict competence.
desarrollando tu
Improving your conflict competence from LinkedIn Learning. You received his BA from Harvard and MLL.
tienes su grado de Harvard, de Dunbar y también en Duke Universidad, en la Universidad de Duke, de abogado.
He's been studying and writing about
Él ha estudiado y escrito
P.R. Sarkar's concept of world.
acerca de los conceptos de gobierno de P.R.
He's
Sarkar
currently
desde
drafting a world
1990 y en
constitution
este
based.
momento está trabajando en una constitución mundial basada en los trabajos de P.R. Sarkar.
Alrighty. Well, thank you
Bienvenido,
very
Craig.
much for
Bueno, muchas gracias primero que todo por invitarme y muchas gracias por esta introducción.
to talk about
Es una buena introducción para poder hablar de
leadership.
gobierno y del concepto de liderazgo. Debo decir que probablemente desde hace 30 años he estado trabajando en la idea de una constitución mundial. Yo fui
and
inspirado
have
por
been
P.R.
researching
Sarkar
and so
y
forth. And I'm
he
hoping
estado
in 2021
investigando y espero que en el 2021 voy a poder tener un borrador para que la gente lo pueda revisar y pueda comentar, y es un instrumento que la gente puede usar para manejar cambios en el gobierno. Déjenme presentar
a notion of
la noción en particular
humanistic perspectives
de
on
las
global governance, because there
perspectivas
are
humanistas en el gobierno global, porque hay una variedad de otras personas que han trabajado en este concepto de cómo gobernar el globo. Siempre hay
governance
unos
because
elementos
people are
implícitos de gobierno global, porque las personas han estado trabajando en problemas globales, pero estos métodos no han sido efectivos. Yo pienso que lo que
very central to this question
es central a esta pregunta es el neohumanismo y el gobierno central. Es la idea de que el neohumanismo, por su definición, eleva
in
el
this case,
humanismo al
meaning the love for
universalismo.
all.
En este caso, amor por todos los seres creados en el universo. Si ustedes tienen esto a una base filosófica, entonces sí se desarrollan gobiernos o
You
procesos
have to make sure
para gobernar,
that they
tienen que asegurarse
and include
de que debe respetar e incluir, en realidad amar no solamente a todas las personas
all of
y
the other living
también
beings in the
todos
world,
los otros seres vivos del mundo. Y para esto aún los seres inanimados, el ecosistema.
do respect from a philosophy like this.
Sí, porque tenemos
Now,
el respeto
the
a
reality
todo en
today
esta filosofía. La realidad en este momento es que tenemos una forma muy diferente de valores que salen de sistemas económicos y sociales
rather than
diferentes.
universalism, they stress materialism, divisiveness, and
De materialismo, división,
where people are trying to get the most out of governance for themselves or for their friends. This kind of
esta
sort of
clase de
not cooperative approach to governance
de no tener esta aproximación.
You know, if you look at the history of our
Si miramos
current
a la
political,
historia de
global political reality,
nuestra política global, que es estos estados soberanos que compiten entre ellos porque están
of the
luchando por
elites
sus propios
in various
intereses, que son
countries.
realmente los intereses de las élites de sus propios desde de la década desde el siglo XIX, en donde la
And so that
comunicación y
the
el transporte
interactions
eran más
among
limitados y las interacciones
affected ones that were very close to them, but didn't affect the world as much as
no,
it
no afectaban tanto al mundo como ahora en este momento porque eran muy limitados.
how this sort
En
of
el siglo XX vimos
global
como
competition among
esta competencia global entre los estados soberanos han contribuido a las guerras más grandes que hemos visto, la guerra
dislocation
mundial,
of
la Primera y la
economies
Segunda Guerra
and
Mundial,
people
y han
was extreme.
perturbado las economías mundiales.
These values
Más recientemente, estos valores que son materialistas y que sirven a pequeños grupos,
in global capitalism
también el
have
capitalismo global han contribuido a lo que llamamos crisis existenciales como el cambio climático, el degradamiento
war
del
and
medio
violence that
ambiente, la violencia que hemos estado experimentando en el siglo XX. Entonces esto nos pone en una situación muy difícil, aunque es muy
based on
natural,
the
basada
political system of
en el
sovereign
sistema político de los estados soberanos y los sistemas económicos como el capitalismo que enfatiza
values. And so
las
where we
ganancias
are
sobre los
today in the
valios.
crisis
Entonces, en donde estamos en la crisis realmente es natural, teniendo en cuenta de los sistemas que hemos desarrollado y de los que venimos.
now, what is true is that the current crises, the climate crisis, environmental degradation, and so forth,
La crisis
are not only
climática
extreme crises,
no
but they are
solamente son crisis extremas, sino que están más allá
sovereign
de la
nation
capacidad
states
de
to
cualquier
control.
estado soberano para controlarlas.
And as a consequence,
Y como consecuencia, desde el punto político, los países del mundo han tenido que encontrar otras formas para poder
global crises.
manejar estas crisis globales. Después de las guerras mundiales, se hicieron esfuerzos para crear
Wars. After World War I, it was the League of Nations. After World War II, it was the United Nations. And to some extent, they've had some success, but in large measure because the parties who make up these organizations, the United Nations represents the countries that are members of the United Nations. And because there's sort of an inherent competition among them, it detracts from the effectiveness of the organization to be able to address the issues that are facing us. A good example, and the United Nations certainly is involved in a number of multinational treaties that countries use to try to address these major problems. In 1992, there was a global summit in Rio de Janeiro that began looking at the environmental crisis and perhaps just the beginnings of recognition of the climate crisis. It took more than 20 years of effort to eventually reach the Paris Climate Accords, which themselves were looked at by many of the scientists as not adequate to be able to actually address the problems, and which were very fragile, as we saw when the United States withdrew at the beginning of the current administration. So the mechanisms that these sovereign states have developed to attempt to address these multinational types of problems have had to be, in effect, jury-rigged. And they are not fully effective, in part because the underlying values, both of the nation-state system and the economic system of global capitalism. Now, this has led citizens groups to try to come up with approaches that would get around these limitations caused by our current systems thinking. After the World War I, but particularly after World War II, there were a number of organizations and groups that emerged that were advocating for a new kind of global governance. The UN is what, in fact, took place, but other people were arguing for a world government, a world constitution, something that would go beyond and actually have authority over the nation states, so that the nation states would no longer be the preeminent governing mechanism in the world, because they saw that the inherent competition among them is counterproductive, and it almost prevents effective moving on these big problems. More recently, there was an interesting effort emerging from Sweden called the Global Challenges Foundation, which sponsored a contest soliciting ideas from people around the world for how to address the major problems that face us now: the climate crisis, environmental degradation, violence in the world among peoples, poverty. And this was a very interesting approach because it solicited citizen feedback and developed new ideas for approaches of either reforming the United Nations to be able to better address these kind of questions, or to come up with new kinds of mechanisms to be able to address our global crises. Now, it's within this backdrop that we find a neo-humanistic approach to global governance. In 1961, Sri P.R. Sarkar said that in order to manifest universalism, and you remember our first slide where neo-humanism elevates humanism to universalism, love for all the creating beings in this world, indeed in this universe. Well, in 1961, Sri Sarkar said that the manifestation of universalism depends on a world government. And I think the recognition there is that this divided sovereign nation state competitive global framework would not be able to allow us to focus on the needs of all, because the competition of the sovereign states was to get the most for their people, or more appropriately, their elites. More than 20 years later, Sri Sarkar noted also that in order to effectively operate a world government, that a world constitution would be required to provide guidance. Now we're going to take a look at both of these things now in a little bit of depth, not a great deal of depth because we don't have time, but we'll take a look at both of them to see what he was talking about. From the standpoint of federal or world government, his ideas was that world government itself would be a confederation of all the federated states of the world. Now, confederation is where countries join together. Some or most of the power is centralized in the confederation government itself. So a world government would have some or most of the powers, but there would be some powers left in the federated states, which would be the equivalent of countries at this point in time. He also said that the federated states or countries would themselves consist of self-sufficient economic units or zones. Well, right now, countries consist of sort of political subdivisions like provinces or states, whereas in the world government that P.R. Sarkar envisions, these would be made up of zones that are created because of the ability to create economic self-sufficiency within them. So it's a big change both in terms of the political structure and ultimately in terms of the economic structure. Now, a world government based on, or certainly in line with, neo-humanistic ideas would be responsible for ensuring the all-round welfare of all citizens. It would focus definitely on economic development, making sure that all people were provided with the minimum essentials for living, and hopefully an ever improving set of essentials for living. It would prevent exploitation, which in Howard's talk, we're seeing how both on a democratic side and on an authoritarian side, there was a great deal of room for exploitation, in part because of leadership that lacked integrity. The world government would have a role, although it would be probably a supervisory role, ensuring the purchasing power for people so that they would have enough money to be able to buy what they needed to maintain their lives. It would also provide for protecting the environment, because if you're following a neo-humanistic philosophy and caring for all living beings, then you need to make sure that plants and animals are protected as well as people. These would be some of the functions, not all of the functions of a world government. In terms of a structure, there would be a legislative body, a bicameral, meaning two-part legislative body, one where representatives would be elected by population, another by some representatives from every state, so that even the smallest countries could have representation. And indeed, the first stage of a world government would in fact be the legislative phase, where it's a lawmaking body, and the carrying out of the laws would be done more by the what would currently be described as countries. So the world government would make laws, the countries would enforce laws. Eventually, though, world government would also have an executive branch, an administrative branch to run the different functions of government that need to be handled. There would be a judicial branch, auditing to handle the financial, and a militia, which is interesting because you think, why would you need a militia? But indeed, there could be conflicts between different political subunits, and to have a global militia to be able to prevent that from happening is part of what he sees would be a structure of a world government. But with a world government structure, typically you would have less need for a military, and as a consequence, a great deal of money could be saved that is wasted with the competitive type of nation-state system we have today. Now, along the lines of what Howard was talking about, the question arises, what kind of leaders or what type of leaders are needed to operate the world government? Clearly, since one of the elements of the world government is to stop exploitation and to promote the welfare of people, the kinds of skills and qualities of leaders are certainly along the lines of the synthetic leaders or sadvipas that Howard was talking about. You need high integrity, morality, spiritual mindedness in order to foster the welfare of everyone and prevent exploitation, or corruption, which we saw from the graphics in Howard's presentation, are rampant in the world today and take away a great deal of the potential that we have for creating a very vibrant human society. Now, in addition, in operating a world government, leaders will also need to have certain specific types of skills that would be appropriate if they were members of the legislature. They need to know how to be able to draft laws effectively. If they were going to be in a judicial part of the government, they need to know something about to be able to interpret laws and to make judicial type of decisions. So people would have legal types of trainings for that. And that would hold true for each aspect of the government, that competency in not only in specific skills coupled with the elements of integrity and morality would be a part of what leaders of a world government would be required to have. Taking a look at the World Constitution side of things, as I said, in 1986, P.R. Sarkar wrote about the need for a world constitution. The Constitution, as he sees it, would enumerate the responsibilities of the world government. In other words, what functions does the world government need to be able to do, or not need to be, must do to be able to govern properly. Also, it will enumerate the rights of people and other living beings, rights that the government must respect. It will also describe the relationship between the world government and subsidiary governments. In other words, national governments, or even governments lower than that, sort of province or state level governments, the economic units that we were talking about before. So it will describe that relationship, because it will become important, as we'll see in a moment, that those kind of relationships are clear, not confusing, and work well together, because the governments at different levels need to be able to work well together to produce the favorable outcomes being desired here. The World Constitution will also set forth the structure of the government, that there'll be an executive branch, a legislative branch, judicial, and so forth. So it will describe the structure and how voting might take place in order to select the people who would be in a world government. And it will provide a process for amending the Constitution, which is something that's generally not done very often. And so it's a fairly rigorous effort to make changes. Now, one of the most interesting aspects of P.R. Sarkar's call for world constitution was a recommendation or discussion about what he calls a charter of rights, or a bill of rights, that would include at least the following four things. It could include more, and probably would include more over time. The first one is that there would be guaranteed security for all plants and animals. And it's such a fascinating first point. This is from a discourse that he gave called Requirements of an Ideal Constitution. Guaranteed security for all plants and animals. I think that really emphasizes the breadth of the neo-humanistic idea of universalism. Care and love for all living beings. A second one is guaranteed purchasing power for all citizens. In other words, this is a way for people to be able to make sure that they're able to afford the essentials for themselves and their families. The third one, guaranteeing of spiritual practice, cultural legacy, education, and indigenous linguistic expression. These are things that Sri Sarkar talks about in a number of his other discourses found in the series Prout in a Nutshell. But these are woven into a specific set of Bill of Rights that would be incorporated into the World Constitution. And the fourth item is a very interesting one. It says human cardinal values take precedence over all other rights. Sri Sarkar talks about this concept of human cardinal values, which are the sort of the essential values that are not changing. They're fundamental to the to the human heart and indeed this human spirit. He talks more about them in a book called Guide to Human Conduct. And what is suggested here is that they are so fundamental that none of the other rights that would be granted in the Constitution would have precedence over them. And so if there were conflicts between decisions based on certain rights, you would always take into consideration whether human cardinal values would be represented or respected or not, and always they would take precedence. Now, let's take a look at, let me go back for a second. Let's take this second charter right, guaranteed purchasing power for all citizens. How could you make that realistic in a constitutional framework? Well, here's an example. It doesn't mean this is the only way it could be written, but one way to write this into a constitution would be to say that each federated state, that's the lower level governments that the world government would be over, each federated state must guarantee purchasing power to all its citizens sufficient to procure the minimum necessities of life, adequate for health and well-being. Now, there are a variety of ways of being able to state this, as I said, but in one sense, you want to mandate that each country or federated state mandate that they provide purchasing power for all citizens. And not just some purchasing power, but purchasing power that's adequate to create health and well-being for those citizens. Once you have a right like that, it will be important to determine how would citizens be able to enforce that right against the government. There are a number of constitutions, particularly in Latin and South America, Latin America and South America, where a right like this is provided, but there is no enforcement mechanism. An enforcement mechanism allows a right to be what's called justiciable, where you can sue or otherwise enforce that right against the government to make sure that it lives up to its approach. Part of this will also have to involve, and this is not the actual language, but it's just saying that a world constitution would need to require governments to support planning efforts, whether it's inside or outside of the government per se, to ensure that purchasing power exists and that it's adequate. And this would be within a concept of decentralized economy that's advocated by Prout that Howard talked about a little bit before. So you have these rights and you need to be able to then weave them together so that they're actually effective and that they mandate that governments be able to do certain things. And if they don't do them, that people are able to enforce those rights and make the government do them. Now, it's pretty clear that creating a world government and drafting a world constitution are large undertakings. But I think that the bigger challenge actually will be in trying to get them implemented. You know, there's one group called the World Constitution and Parliamentary Association, which in the 1960s began working on creating a world constitution. And by 1977, they had actually drafted one with help from people from all over the world, various jurists and other legal people. And since that time, they've been working to try to get it implemented. There's been a lot of pushback from national governments and others not wanting to do it. And indeed, Sri Sarkar sees that the one of the main impediments of implementing a world government will come from the people who are in power in the current sovereign nation states and even the lower level political subdivisions below that. And that's because they will lose their power. They want to hold on to their power because it's benefiting them greatly, but it's not necessarily benefiting the people that they are in charge of ruling. Now, the question is, how do you get there? How can you implement a world government and or a world constitution? Sri Sarkar talks about this in several different places in his writings. Some of that has to do with how the people who will be leading such an effort need to think and act. One way is he recommends that they stay more focused on constructive, service-minded approaches and to avoid, when possible, the political arena, as he calls it, the dirty arena of party politics. I think this has to do much with the sort of the mentality of being able to keep people focused on the positive aspect, the neo-humanistic aspect of what they're trying to accomplish. In many ways, he said that if governments try to prevent a movement towards world government, especially when it's presented to people as a positive alternative, that ultimately they will get, as he calls it, agitated. And eventually that agitation will lead to a revolution causing the countries to have to support a world constitution. But one of the things he talks about in terms of that revolution is the idea that there's one kind of revolution that he describes as nuclear revolution, which is preferable to other kinds in that it involves a transformation of all aspects of collective life: social, political, economic, spiritual, intellectual, cultural, where you have a full transformation of society, which then sets the stage for much more easily bringing about a world government. But obviously this work is not easy. Yet I think he's saying that it's the work that is required to happen. And the question then becomes, what kind of leaders are needed to be able to do this? Clearly, you're going to need a large number of highly trained, accomplished leaders to be able to implement a world government. Clearly, a number of the qualities that they will have will be similar to the qualities that people who would then operate a world government would have. The integrity, morality, spirituality. These things will be the same because these things are what will keep the direction focused on a neo-humanistic outcome where love of all created beings will be at the forefront. But in terms of actually implementing, there's going to be a need for people who are more able to mobilize masses of people, inspire them to overcome obstacles that will be put in their way to create a world government. So it will be a more, I don't know, revolutionary is the right term, but they will be more inspiring people to create the change. And then once it's changed, a new set of leaders may come in. Could be some of the same, but there'll be a number of new leaders come in with the same integrity and morality, but who will have more of an operational orientation with skills required to keep something running. Now, the next presentation that we have is going to be looking at how do you develop the kind of leadership skills that are necessary to create synthetic leaders to be able then to do this kind of work. And I think that I'll hold questions at this point, as Howard did, until after our next presenter, Satya Tanner, discusses the creation of leadership, and then we'll come back and address specific questions at that time. Okay?
Okay, thank you very much, Greg. Yeah, so I'm keeping track of some of the questions that people are putting in the chat, and we'll try to address them, as many as we can at the end. But due to time constraints, we're going to move on to Satya's presentation. Are you here, Satya?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me
Yes,
okay?
she is. Yes, so
Very good.
Satya Tanner has been working for 16 years, had a career as a pilot and aerospace engineer in the Royal Australian Air Force, leading people and managing projects. In recent years, she has been working for the energy sector in Denmark, primarily with offshore wind energy. She's worked extensively with setting up learning organization principles and teams, and has a passion for neo-humanist leadership development. Satya has a master's in leadership, a master in training and development, a bachelor's in aeronautical engineering, and is a registered project management professional. Okay, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks, Howard. If I can just ask Ricky, do you mind sharing the slides on my behalf, please?
Sure. Just give me one moment.
Thank you. Excellent, thanks very much. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, as it's just been introduced, leadership development. So if we can just go to the first, oh, it's maybe not quite working. Here we go. So we go to the first slide. I think it's important to take into account the story of why we lead. At the moment, what I see is a lot of people who are leading for more competitive or perhaps selfish means, and perhaps don't have an eye on the bigger picture. I see a lot of leadership that is based around, just their generation or maybe with the next generation. It doesn't take a look at a much, much bigger story. And so that much bigger story is to do with, why are we on a rock that is circling around a big star in the middle of the universe somewhere? And what is all of that about? And so one of the ideas that comes out of this is this idea that civilizations are trying to develop themselves. There are environmental circumstances that give rise to, for example, in our case, a human population. But existence in itself is not enough. We also want to develop, we want to progress, and we want to move towards something bigger than that. So when you have this large picture of what are we really here for, and what is the direction that we're going in order to sustain society, not just to be in competition with each other, not just to have success because I either grew a business or led a state government or something like this, but actually something even bigger than those boundaries. And so neo-humanism is about this too, right? It's about extending ourselves beyond those boundaries and looking at things from a universal perspective. So this is in essence the large universal story that it's important to have in mind when we consider leadership. And so what is then the purpose of leadership when you have this story in mind? Well, it's facilitating that bigger story. It's also about the principle of social equality, as we've heard from previous speakers. And it's also about cultivating a universal outlook and the ethic of love. So I'll go to the next slide. So this particular slide, I'm only seeing half of it. Ricky, if you can scroll a little bit further up, there we go. I'm not going to go through every single thing on this slide, but it's just to say, this is Sahel and Ayatollah's method called causal-layered analysis. And what I'm trying to demonstrate in this slide, I like to use CLA for looking at everything, culture, systems, and the tangible results or the tangible experiences that we have. So I find it really good for analyzing cultures, analyzing root causes of things. And so what Craig has presented on is at the systemic level, where we're looking at a global governance solution. But what we also need on top of that is things at the worldview and values levels, or the story and metaphor levels. And this is where leadership comes into play. So if you have a good system, it's like a car. You can have a maniac take over a car, or you can have a good driver take over a car, and you have two very different outcomes. So what we pay attention to with respect to leadership development has to be something that allows for this complementary solution on the right-hand side, that allows for good, healthy leadership, that has good, healthy systems, that therefore leads to good, healthy outcomes. So we'll go to the next one. And then what is Sakar Sadvipra? So in the world according to Satya, Sakar Sadvipra is leadership for realizing the potential of humanity. So that brings us back to that large picture, that large story. And some of the key points around that, I don't want to go into a lot of detail around it because I want to talk about some other tools today, but some of the key points around that are sustainable, benevolent leadership, understanding the need for social change. This is back to the synthetic leadership piece that Howard was bringing in. We've also got to be looking at leadership that prioritizes human value over social value. Do we want nepotism that's more based on social value, or do we want more equality based on human value? I see you for who you are rather than the social status that you have. And who you are is important more so than the social value that you have. Universal mindset, which I've alluded to earlier, and then systems of collective leadership, collective decision-making with appropriate checks and balances. So it's not a case of pure flat or pure hierarchy. There's more complexity in these systems in order to deal with our own complexity, basically. Go to the next one. So what are some examples of benevolent leadership models? At this point, this is where I'm grounding it into leadership theory itself. And for those of you who are interested to know more, I suggest you take a screenshot or a photo of this page, and you can go and you can Google these topics, and you can find a lot of information out there about these types of leadership models. So authentic leadership model is acting and speaking in accordance with your values. Servant leadership is leading with the goal to serve people. This is very high level definitions, by the way. Shared leadership is leadership from members of the team, not just the appointed leader. So it's a way to share the leadership approach. It can be co-leadership, it can be really pushing decisions right down. Transformational leadership, so this is this visionary, motivating and good role model types of leaders. Situational leadership is altering your leadership style to match the needs of the people. So for example, the way that I might lead a very senior and experienced person who's a specialist is going to be very different to someone who's a brand new graduate who's come into an organization, for example. And then of course, revolutionary leadership. So this is this idea of really understanding what is social change, how does it happen, how do we bring about shifts in power, how do we disrupt things? We'll go to the next one. So then what are some educational models for leadership development? So if someone needs to mute, we can hear the wind against their microphone. So educational models for long-term leadership development. Basically, leadership isn't a weekend effort. It's not a 2-week effort. Of course, learning about leadership for a weekend or 2 weeks is really helpful, but it's basically a lifetime effort. It's a lifetime journey, and it's part of a much longer developmental pathway. Most of the leadership programs out there run from between 3 to 12 months, and they're part of a pathway for leadership development. So you can see
Jadi
down the
bukan sesuatu yang hanya bisa
example, you might, for example, see
terjadi
there's
karena
a program
workshop dalam
itself, there's a program around leading others, and then maybe
diakhirkan.
a program around
Jadi
leading.
membutuhkan konsistensi sepanjang hidup. Jadi kebanyakan program leadership sekarang itu jalan paling tidak selama 3-12 bulan. Dia seringkali bagian dari pembangunan kepemimpinan atau perang kepemimpinan dalam sebuah sebuah lintasan. Jadi bisa terdiri dari pertemuan tatap muka,
and corporate, a business not-for-profit and government leadership models can look like this. Of course, when we're looking at social change, activism, that sort of thing, it's perhaps going to be a slightly different model, a slightly different content that comes into it. But the point is that there's already a good baseline to start with, and then add the extra pieces in that we might be interested to work with. So let's go on to the next one. So now I want to look at what are some of the leadership assessments that are out there. So in one of the example that I gave above, I talked about doing some sort of personality assessment. There are lots of different leadership assessments that exist. So what I'm doing is just giving you a selection of a handful, there's plenty more than what I'm about to show, but a handful of leadership development assessments that in the world according to Satya, I think are really helpful and quite cutting edge. So I want to introduce you to these ideas, and it's not to say that they are the only ones out there, and it's not to say that there's not even more, but it's just to give you a little taste, I guess you could say, of the buffet. And yeah, so we're going to be looking at we're going to be looking at survey-based leadership assessments. We're going to be looking at more objective assessments that look at complexity of mind. We're going to be looking at personality and intercultural awareness. And then lastly, I'll cover off on some things in relation to ethical and moral development. So we'll go to the next one. So behavioral survey-based methods. These ones tend to come from more of a psychological background. So organizational psychologists often are behind a lot of these types of tools. And what they are is, there's two that I've included here. There's one called the Leadership Circle, which is on the left-hand side, and there's one called Safe to Great, which is on the right-hand side. And these are subjective surveys. So how they operate is you fill in a survey of what you think your leadership behaviors are, and like it's like scales, on a scale of 1 to 5, how much are you this way versus that way, and so you select a scale. Then it also goes out to between 7 and 12 other people, or potentially more, of course, but usually between 7 and 12 people around you, people below you, people who are peers, and people above you. And then what you get from that is an analysis to say, okay, this is how I see myself, and this is how other people see me. So what's nice about, sorry, there's someone not on mute at the moment. So what's nice about this is that you get you also get to see the difference in how you see yourself versus how other people are seeing you. These models are based on the same axes basically. On one side, you will have task orientation, and on the other side, you'll have relationship orientation. And this is the fundamental basis of most leadership theory, or some of the oldest leadership theory is around leaders tend to be more task or relationship oriented. And the best is to be able to blend both. Then on the vertical axis, what you'll tend to see is fear versus trust-based models. So this is where the psychological component comes in. The degree to which we're operating out of fear-based patterns that are controlling us versus the degree to which we're able to operate out of trust and what I would consider to be secure attachment, that we trust and are able to give a go, whatever it is that we want to give a go. And so the idea is to try and move things more towards the top half of the circle in the leadership circle, which is the left-hand one, and in the right-hand one on safe to great is to move from the red, the green, and the grey to try and move as much as you can into the blue. It's very difficult to be perfectly in one of these spots, but it's a subjective measure of your leadership impact. It's not to say that you are exactly that, but that is the impact that you're having on people. So if it comes up that you're having controlling behaviors, it may or may not be true. It's more that certainly that's the way you're perceived. So you at core may or may not be controlling. Only you can know that. But there are impacts that you're having that have people feeling some sort of controlling behavior coming from you. So this is actually a really great tool for instantly changing people's leadership behaviors into something more healthy, and also combined with techniques for transforming fear. So this is where some of the psychological piece comes into it. Let's go to the next slide. So the next one comes from the cognitive basis. So this particular one is more of an objective assessment. And this is called the Leadership Decision Making Assessment, which comes from Lectica Inc., who are a not-for-profit in the US. And this one was born out of, they do a lot of work with educational institutes. They develop techniques for learning, particularly action learning cycles, and they work with a lot of schools and things like this for helping people to develop faster by actually slowing down their learning and being more reflective in their learning, so that they can really, develop, for example, critical thinking and things like this. And so they were contacted after they were contacted by some federal agencies in the US after the 9/11 Twin Towers situation, to say, our leaders didn't see this coming. We're not good at dealing with volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environments. Can you help us develop some sort of way of creating better leaders that are able to do this, not just ones that can hold the reins, but ones that really know how to see the future or not predict the future necessarily, but work with the future, work with uncertainty, work with volatility. And so what they did is they came up with this model for how leaders can make good decisions in what's called VUCA conditions. This is this volatility and uncertainty. So it's basically someone who's enough complexity of mind to match the complexity of the situation. Someone who can think and communicate clearly, and someone who has what they distill as being core VUCA skills. So decision-making skills, your ability to collaborate, contextualize, and perspective coordination. And I just want to say perspective coordination is something that is super, super important, because on this planet right now, we do have a large crisis with respect to different perspectives and not being able to coordinate those perspectives and not being able to, in effect, get along. And we see a big polarization of perspectives happening at the moment. So someone who develops good VUCA skills is able to, or understands how to coordinate these perspectives. So how do they test for something like this? If you can go to the next slide. So basically what they do is they get you to write a response to a real world decision. They give you a scenario, and what you do is you write your response, like what would you do? And you say, I would do A, B, C. And then they would say, what are your main, they might ask, what are the main considerations that come forward in this? And you would say it's this, that, the other. And then they say, and why is that? And so you give a lot of detail that helps them to understand the way that you think, the complexity of your thinking, and these sorts of aspects. Now, based on that, they're able to determine which level you come into. They've developed some levels that come off a long history of cognitive development theorists, basically. And so what they say is that there's very black and white thinking, which is what they call advanced linear thinking, and most people on the planet fit into this domain. It's very rules-based. And then you have more deeper, more complex thinking. So they call it early systems, advanced systems, and then early principles thinking. So this is really understanding the principles that create the complexity in the first place. And as I said, the majority of the population fit within advanced linear thinking. I think it was maybe 15% or something fit within early systems, 15 to 20 or something like this. And then it must have been 5 to 10 or something within advanced systems, and about 1% in early principles. So what this offers is a very clear ladder to follow. So it's not just based on survey, because it's more objective. You can actually, with the report that they give you, it gives you 12 months worth of development activities that help you actually think more complexly and think more principles based. So it's a very nice way for dealing with this particular aspect of leadership development. So go to the next one. And so the final tool I wanted to show you is this one called Global DISC. And this is an intercultural assessment, which also helps people understand themselves and how they relate to each other. So it's a bit like 2 tests in one assessment. It's based on what's called the DISC model, which is very common in a lot of organizations. But the guy who developed this, Chaba, what he did is he then was able to map DISC against different cultural preferences. So in effect, you're able to get 2 tests out of one assessment, and you're asked 15 questions, and then based on that, you're able to see, what are the preferences that I have, and you're also able to map yourself against your culture, meaning your national culture, all sorts of cultures, your national culture, the average for your gender, the average for your generation, your profession, personality types, things like this. So it's a really nice tool for, and then there's a whole theory behind how different types of people relate to each other and what their needs are, and where we tend to have miscommunication around that. So what makes it very strong is it helps people get along, because it comes with an educational package behind it that really helps people to understand where the misunderstandings are coming from and how they can move forward beyond that. So yeah, that's as I said, Global DISC by ICQ Global. On to the next one. So I wanted to make a comment on moral development. So this is, the idea is, leading with principles over rules. Back when we looked at the LDMA, it talked about principles-based thinking, and maybe only 1% of the population have actually attained that level of cognitive development, at least when it comes to leadership decision-making assessments. The morality is not an absolute truth, although there are some perhaps that have the opinion that it is. But it's more complex than that. We are more complex than that. You know, one particular thing is not always good. It depends so much on the context. So there are a couple of ways that we can measure it. One way you can measure it, or there's more than what I have on offer here, but I'm just showing some. You can compare your standards against societies, and obviously some of the challenges with that is if the average society's morality is not that high, then it's not going to necessarily be a good measuring stick of what you could achieve, let's say. You can also identify your level of moral development, and this comes back to, it's tied a little bit into the levels that we saw with the LDMA to do with complexity of thinking. It's not exactly that, but it's tied into this idea of moving up towards more principles-based thinking. That doesn't tell you that your morals are good or bad, it just tells you how sophisticated you are at thinking about your morals. You know, do you think about the principles? You could have a principle that's, you know, death and destruction is really good, but you understand the principle behind it and how that complies. So you would not necessarily be doing what is good for the overall picture of, you know, humanity continuing its existence, but you have very good cognitive development, albeit a warped view on how we need to survive as a society. You can also measure your prioritization of values, and this one I find quite interesting, and I think this is where neo-humanism can take a model like this, and there's even, I think, some research possibilities out of this. So there's a sports manager's assessment of moral development that I found, and what they do in that one, you can imagine if you're a sports manager, you're often competing within yourself. The moral dilemma that might come about, or the values dilemma that might come about, is if someone does something that's kind of cheating, but let's say the referee doesn't notice, do you, and the referee, you know, gives you the point or gives you the whatever, depending on the game, are you going to put your hand up and say, actually, that wasn't mine, or not? So is competition more important to you, or is being honest in that situation more important to you? And so what this particular score sheet does is it gives you a bunch of dilemmas to choose from, and then each one consists of like one that is more a competition value, and the other one is more of a human value. And so you can, every time someone selects a human value over a competition value, then they get a higher score. So I do think that there is some room for neo-humanist endeavors to create some sort of similar test based on some of these things that are already out there, whereby we would be looking at how do we put human value over social value or competition. And then how do we develop with moral development? I'll just get you to go back to just a little bit more, thanks. Moral development levels. So when Lectica talk about the development levels, what they do is they get you to start making your moral principles explicit. This gives you the cognitive aspect of understanding your principles. But then also we need to teach and practice principles-based decision making. And then we need to also teach how to prioritize moral values. You know, if you're in a conflict between non-harming and non-stealing, how do you prioritize those two? You know, what is the thing that takes us towards that big story that I mentioned at the beginning of, you know, the evolutionary story of humanity moving forward. So yeah, which is then the last point. And so then I just want to leave you with a quote from Sarkar, which is on the last page there, Ricky. What are the marvels of civilization for if people are prevented from manifesting themselves? If they, hang on, I can't see the very bottom of it. If they do not get the opportunity to build good physiques or invigorate their intelligence with knowledge, or to broaden their hearts with love and compassion. Greatest of all is love. So that's it from me. We've got like 5 minutes left. Sorry for the long session, but 5 minutes left for questions for all three of us, I guess.
And just a reminder to participants that you may be muted. So if you would like to ask a question, I believe there are also some questions that have been asked previously in the chat.
Yeah, so we'll start going to some of the questions. We have actually until, I believe, 11:20. So we have about
Very good.
25 minutes here. So there were several questions regarding the how to implement all of this, and as far as practically speaking, how are we to start to make these changes? Because we talked about huge changes. We're talking about world government, new types of leadership. So several people asked, in what order do we proceed? What are the steps towards achieving this? So I don't know if Craig or Satya want to jump in with this, say something.
Yeah, it's probably good for all of us to jump in.
Yeah. I mean, I personally, I think that what we are doing now, and you can see from the assortment of incredible presentations that have taken place and will take place in this conference, the amount of work being done at all levels, I think is essential and necessary to start influencing, affecting society, moving in the right direction. The dissemination of ideas about Prout and neo-humanism is critical to this, to prepare more and more people to understand what these are and how they operate, what they stand for, and to implement it, as Peter Sage was talking about, really putting into practice neo-humanism. I know there's a lot of Proutists in the world that have started a lot of different types of projects. Some of these projects are projects that are not specifically identified with Prout, but are moving people towards these ideas, and some are more Prout clearly Prout projects under the name of Prout. And so all of these projects also are moving people into the understanding of decentralized economy. There's also a lot of interest in decentralized economy already out there, and economic democracy. So it's networking. We're doing a lot of networking and getting people involved in that. All of that, I think, is essential to prepare people for this. And the development of leaders. We need leaders. We need neo-humanistic leaders. We need Prout leaders. We need synthetic leadership. We need Sadvipras. So all of this development of leaders, I think, is critical to start or continue in some ways building this leadership, to develop leadership programs. It was just one of the things why we were motivated to initiate this particular session and to make the proposal, because the proposal that we're making is not a theoretical proposal. It's really thinking practically how to start to train people. And I think you can see from Satya's presentation, there's a lot of incredible leadership technologies out there and cutting edge ideas that we can adapt, adopt, and utilize in training of another level of Sadvipras for the society. So I think all of those are essential. Of course, social situations and political situations, economic situations are moving society also, and these are, of course, beyond our control, and are moving society towards this change, this ultimate change. And so we have to be prepared with, we have to have our act together, so to speak, to be ready to sort of capture the wind, in our sails and move forward with this wave of change that's coming about in any case. Anyway, these are just my thoughts.
Satya, do you want to share?
Sure. From my perspective, the idea of being able to just suddenly put something into place comes from a black and white thinking model and also like a waterfall model of project management, you might say, where you say, I want to go here, here are the 10 steps, and this is the plan. And the thing is, that's not how revolutionary leaders work. Revolutionary leaders are able to adapt to change. So if you're the kind of leader who can know your North Star, but go in this direction and then have to then go that direction and then go that direction, then the point is you have the skills for navigating that space. So at least as I understand it, our job is not to create a sausage factory of people who can make and follow a plan. Our job is to create people who can think and problem solve and figure it out. So for me, the question of how we're going to make that shift to world government is a little bit redundant if you're asking for the milestones, because that's not going to happen. It's going to be different in different places in the world. Depends on the power regimes that you're facing. I think we're probably not going to see bang, all of a sudden there's a world government. I think it's going to be slow changes, won and fought here and there, and then things come together. You know, as we make those kinds of shifts. It's a bit like when we suddenly see a big legislative change for equal rights in a country, for example, that's not because one day they just decided to make a change. It's because of years and years of fighting this angle and fighting that angle and fighting this angle and fighting that angle. And then eventually something shifts and it topples over. So I think we're going to see a similar type of progression. So that's why, from my perspective, the most important thing right now is to focus on educating people with the ability to be able to do this, to be able to fight the right fights, to have the critical thinking skills, to know what are the right fights as well, to be able to discern propaganda, because knowledge is, you know, under threat right now in all sorts of ways. So teaching people how to work with these kinds of skills is really important. And it actually doesn't even start with Neo-Humanist College. I would even say it starts when kids are really young. And that's why I think like Neo-Humanist principles in preschools and, you know, whatever the lowest age you can go to is just super important, because it cultivates some of these mindsets or the principles that are required for these mindsets in the first place. So that's I think.
I tend to agree that the leadership piece of it is key. The thing that for me is sitting out there is that there will be circumstantial pressures that will speed this along. And the thing that first comes to mind is the climate crisis. The pandemic has shaken the world a great deal, but it will be very small compared to the climate crisis as it seems to be emerging. And we will be facing you know, almost existential threat to humanity and to all life on the planet. What are we going to do then? It's not like we can wait 75 years to see if we can get the leadership programs up and running. We're going to need to, you know, like you said, Satya, people are going to need to be very nimble and take advantage of the circumstances and mobilize people. And I think it, in some respects, may happen faster than we think, and it may have to happen faster than we think for us to be able to survive well.
Let me see. You know, it's interesting. I remember watching a video about the global economic conference that they have in Davos, in Davos, what do you call it? Davos in Switzerland, right? And, you know, at that time, I think it was 2000, 2001, they were protesting about the external debt. And they interviewed some officials. They weren't the exact heads of states, but different officials from Europe. And they were like, some of them was very direct. It's like, we need, I mean, the UN is not doing anything. We need a world government. I mean, and I think there is a considerable support for this idea. You know, it's just really suppressed, especially, for example, in the United States, of course, it's very polemical, you know, what about anything about the United Nations, but a lot of people around the world really can see the usefulness the need for a world government. So I think as these circumstantial pressures mount, I think there'll be more and more interest in establishing something like this. There was a question about cardinal human values, which Craig mentioned, to take precedent over other values. And maybe someone can speak about or clarify actually that term, what we're actually referring to.
Well, it's interesting in terms of, it occurs in a number of places in Pierre Sarkar's writings. There's some elements where he talks about it as sort of the silver lining between the spiritual world and the psychophysical world, psychospiritual world. And so, I mean, in one sense, it's it has to do with the essential values of human beings, like respecting the right to life for not only people, but for all beings. On the other hand, there's some very specific descriptions where he says that to live in accordance with ethical principles called Dhamma Niyama, which are described in his book, Guide to Human Conduct, is to live in accordance with human cardinal principles. So it has some variety to it, but it's very clear here that you don't want to have a set of rights in a constitution which ultimately would lead to something that would seem amiss. You're guaranteeing the rights of plants and animals, security to them. Does that mean that no human being could eat a plant or an animal? Even vegetarians, could they not eat plants? Everybody would die. And so it's kind of, trying to resolve possible conflicts like that. But that's just my thoughts. Satya and Howard, what do you think?
Yeah, I have a similar perspective. And this is also why having moral development helps us understand the way in which we're prioritizing certain values and the impact that has. So like in the example that you give, around eating, I mean, this is where the principle is around, back to this big story, basically. So for me, like a lot of these things come back to, we have to prioritize based on the big story, and the big story is part of what guides having these cardinal principles in the first place. And I think where the challenge comes is where these cardinal principles rub up against each other, because then in that place is where you start to have some moral dilemmas. If you can't eat, but you have to steal in order to stay alive, in order to not be harmed or not harm your families because they're on the verge of starvation, how do you deal with that? So these are the things that we need to reconcile, and the prioritizations that we need to be looking at.
Yeah, I don't think, I think in regard to the balance between human rights and the rights of all living beings, I think my feeling is that the cardinal human values incorporate both of them, and that when we make any decisions or any policies, we need to consider the lives of all living beings, and human beings as part of that. But in general, my understanding of cardinal human values is that anything that obstructs physical, mental, and spiritual development of a human being, goes against that, impedes it in any way, is against human cardinal values. Human cardinal values stand for that all around the physical development, mental development, spiritual development, as a complete, comprehensive understanding of what human beings, how human beings are moving forward to their ultimate goal of self-realization. I think that's because, of course, Sarkar doesn't specifically define it, but if you read around the different texts, that's at least that's my understanding of what it means. Okay, so there is Yeah, I'm not sure if you answered this, Sat. There was Sid asked something about psychosocial training. And I think some of those training assessments speak to that. Maybe you want to talk
Yeah,
directly?
I do think they do. And I really think that psychological development needs to be a big part of leadership training. And it is able to sort of sneak its way in there via some of these tools, because ultimately what lies at the heart of a lot of unhealthy leadership behaviors is fear. And fear is the basis of well, it's not the basis of, but it definitely hits on a lot of the psychological elements, I guess you can say. So understanding our own psychology, understanding what our traumas are, knowing how to heal our traumas, how to transform our traumas, enables us to operate in a completely different way, because we're no longer being operated by our unconscious patterns that are outside of our awareness. We're bringing the unconscious things that are outside of our awareness into our awareness so that we act as more aware leaders. And so I completely think that psychosocial training forms a part, or needs to form a part of leadership training, for sure, because our inner world drives our outer world.
Yeah, I would like to say something. I am Marianne from Sweden, and I have two focus areas. One is money, and I have been out for 30 years now speaking about new money systems and what harm the capitalism is doing with our world. And I would say that Howard, he said something about many people want this world government now, and he mentioned the meeting in Davos. And I would say that it's a very dangerous group of people promoting a world government in these circumstances. So if neo-humanism should do this, it would be with no contact with these people on the first, because they are just reproducing capitalism. And then I'm thinking about, we have this transition towns movement. It's called Omställningsrörelsen in Sweden. A lot of good projects. And in Sweden, we also have an interest-free bank where I have been on the board for some years. And I can see that very good ideas, very nice thinking doesn't come into place, or it starts and then it stops because we can't cooperate and we are not trained in conflict solutions. So for me, that is tragic, and I would like to go this to make this education to be a better leader myself. I would love to do that, although I'm old now, I'm 72. Thank you for letting me in.
No problem. 72 is not old. You can just take a poll here. I don't think people will say that 72 is old. But in any case, yeah, the people I saw talking about world government were not the people representing capitalism at this meeting. These were people who were in like lower level government positions that were there because they had to be there. Actually, they were promoting the as far as the world debt, amnesty regarding the world debt. So they were actually, I think, representing humanity or human interests, and were more in line with that than promoting capitalism. But anyway, I take your point. And I just want to say that the training that this leadership, I think everyone, all of us need to take leadership training. You know, Sarkar said at one point, he said that everyone should become Sadvipra, and everyone should make others Sadvipra. And that's what he said. You know, I mean, his idea wasn't that we're going to create, as I said, this tiny, you know, group of people that are going to run the world, but that we needed to develop the leadership capabilities that are inherent in all people, you know. And I mean, if leadership is being able to influence, I think that's what we're here for, is to influence others in a positive way. And to do that, we need more training, we need more development to do this. And so I encourage everyone to think about getting more leadership training, and maybe even if we do get this program together, we're going to develop different types of trainings for many types of people. So hopefully everyone will be able to take advantage of it. Let's see. Yeah. There are many good questions here.
We should only take the ones that we can answer in 2 minutes.
Right. Someone mentioned about the Baha'i also supporting world government. You want to say something about that, Craig?
I mean, there's a number of religious or spiritual groups that do Baha'i. I mean, the people in TM have world government ideas. There's a number of groups in India after World War II that were very supportive of world government, not necessarily religious or spiritual groups, but it's actually quite widespread. One of the comments that Marianne had, which is that the problem with a lot of groups is that they get in conflict with one another and don't know how to resolve it, is true even in the world government field. The one group of that's promoting a world constitution, their biggest challenge now is that they can't agree with each other. So the leadership development that Satya was talking about, one of the phases or aspects of it is, in fact, how can you manage conflict when it inevitably occurs?
Right. Scott asked one question. He said, can human societies at this point handle subtlety and nuance in their simple world constitution?
Satya, you had one of the leadership things that talked about a simple elegance as a way of people being able to approach things.
Sorry, can you repeat the question again? Because I was searching for it in the chat, but
looking at whether we're capable of creating a constitutional structure that's going to be able to handle this subtlety and nuance and the vast differences from one culture to the other.
I think from my perspective, it would depend where you start. Like what you're able to unite people on in the first place may just be one scope. And then from that, I would imagine that you learn certain principles around how to structure these types of things. So for example, if it was something related to human rights, that a world government started with, dealing with human rights, because obviously this model doesn't take the economic piece into account. So, I think human rights can come back to principles, if that makes sense. So I'm not a legal expert, so I don't know how to put that into legal language and a constitutional language, but I'd be surprised if they can't come up with a way of making it more principles-based thinking.
Well, I think it's, the thing that I really liked was the discussion of how the implementation of a world government probably comes through some form of revolution. And the one that Sri Sarkar talks about as the preferred one is a nuclear revolution, where you change the values, you change the entire system of the socio economic, political, cultural, intellectual, spiritual. A renaissance across the society makes the world government much easier. if you just create a world government within a sort of a intellectual or psychic framework where all of these divisive tendencies are still there, then the nuance becomes very difficult, I think.
Yes, synthetic leadership really means that these types of leaders are going to have to understand the inner dynamics of society and be able to pinpoint those areas that are really causing exploitation. And at that point, they're going to have to mobilize people, and that mobilization may be initially through publication, through media, through personal contact and organizing, and then eventually, as usually what happens is the exploitation increases, and then people will get more polarized, and then move towards a greater type of change model. So all of these things, imagine this type of leadership, we'll have to understand, not only assimilate these types of leadership qualities, but be able to apply them in different situations as society moves along. There are many organizations and entities now involved in this change. And I think by creating a leadership like this, they'll be able to move together with these other groups and organizations and other types of leaders to accelerate this movement. So I think we've reached the end of our time here. I want to thank our other presenters, Craig and Satya. Incredible presentations. And I hope everyone got something out of this. And again, if you're at all interested in the things that we've talked about, in collaborating, working with us on developing these types of trainings, and or help work with Craig on his world government, world constitution development, please indicate this in the survey that you'll receive at the end of this conference. So thank you again, and namaskar.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists, Craig, Howard, and Satya. We now have a 10-minute break for all of our participants, and we will be setting up for our next session, which will